Started. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of Security in Context, I'd like to welcome you to today's event. My name is Omar Dahi, and I'm an associate professor of economics at Hampshire College and the director of Security in Context. Security in Context is a research initiative and network on peace, conflict, and international affairs. For more information about our project, our research, and upcoming events, please visit our website, securityincontext.com, where you can subscribe to our mailing list, follow us on Twitter at Security Context, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we'll be posting all that information in the chat function. What I'd like to do is to then move quickly to introducing today's panel on understanding Russia, Chinese, and US foreign policy. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to mention that today's event is meant to be the first in a series of webinars convened by Security in Context and co-organized by Professor Michael Klare and myself to examine the impact of 21st century geopolitics and great power competition, particularly as they play out on third countries and societies in other countries, including developing countries. Of course, our webinar today comes in the shadow of potential war in Europe. I should stress that today's panel was scheduled long before this current crisis. And of course, our speakers will naturally address the current crisis as they see fit. This is also an opportunity to step back and discuss the broader context, the history, the longer-term dynamics. Even if war is averted, which we hope it will be, and there are potential signs today that it may be, this is unfortunately unlikely to be the last crisis. And so we want to think together about the broader picture and think about moving forward in a way that counters problematic frameworks, corrects misunderstandings, and raises awareness about what's at stake in all of these issues. With that, we are very excited and very lucky to be able to discuss these issues with a list of a distinguished lineup of speakers. I'll briefly introduce them. I won't mention their full bios, but we'll post them in the chat. And then I'll hand it over to them. You can start adding your questions as the webinar goes on through the Q&A function. Please feel free to post them at any time. I'll collect them and try to integrate them into the discussion as we move forward. With that, let me start by quickly introducing our speakers. Our first speaker will be Michael Klare, Five College Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Arms Control Association and Defense Correspondent at The Nation magazine. Michael's widely written on US military policy, international peace and security, has over 15 books. Most recently, his book was All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. After that, we are having Professor Constantine Fleshikoff, a former foreign policy analyst at the Institute of US and Canada Studies in Moscow. Constantine emigrated to the US in 1998. He's the author of several books, most recently, The Crimean Nexus, Putin's War, and the Clash of Civilizations. After that, we'll hear from Daria Isachenko, a researcher and an associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, the SWP. Her current research focus is on Russia-Turkey relations, the Black Sea, European security. And before joining SWP, she worked on unrecognized states, particularly in the post-Soviet space. We'll be then hearing from Professor Min Yi, who is an associate professor at the Pardee School at Boston University and the author of several books, most recently, The Belt, Road, and Beyond by Cambridge University Press. She's also the guest editor of a special issue that I think is just coming out for the Journal of East Asian Studies called China's Capital Goes Global, The Belt, Road, and Beyond. So please check that out. Last but not least, we have Professor Lee Jones, Professor of Political Economy and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London. His research focuses on security, governance, and development in the Asia Pacific. He's the author of many books, most recently, Fractured China, How State Transformation is Shaping China's Rise. You can check out his work at his website, leejones.tk, and he tweets at Dr. Lee Jones. With that, I would like to turn it off to Michael Klare.
Thank you very much, Omar, and I'm delighted to be joined by this distinguished and interesting group of co-panelists, and I look forward to what you all have to say. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief so that there's more time for you folks to speak. I'm just going to make a few opening remarks to set this in the context of the project that Omar and I have undertaken at Security in Context, which is to look at great power competition globally, particularly as it affects the global South, but to look at the global chessboard. So in this panel, we hope to obtain a better understanding of the changing global geopolitical chessboard. And by that, I mean the political, economic, and military interplay of the great powers, mainly the US, China, and Russia, their interplay with each other, with regional powers like, say, India and Japan and Turkey and Germany and others, and with local powers around the world and local peoples around the world. This interplay has become more complex and dangerous in recent years as Russia and China have become more powerful and more assertive in pursuing their interests, not only within their own region, but further afield. And as the United States has become more determined to resist those efforts by Russia and China to assert their interests further afield. So all of this has created a much more complex global environment. Now, until recently for the United States, the epicenter of the global chessboard was centered in Kabul and Damascus and Baghdad. And if you looked at a map, if you went to the war colleges of the military services, you'd most likely see maps of that part of the world on the background of the officers you were speaking with. That's where they were serving in combat. That's what their focus was. But that's changed very dramatically since 2018, when the Department of Defense adopted its new National Defense Strategy, the NDS, written under the aegis of then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, who famously said in announcing the new document that from now on, great power competition with Russia and China is the dominant focus of US military planning, not counterterrorism. And this has resulted in a dramatic shift in the orientation of the US military, away from low intensity operations in remote areas to high-end operations, what they call high-end operations, with what they call near peer adversaries. Hard to say that, but countries like Russia and China that are closing in on the United States in their military capacity. So this has led to a buildup of American nuclear forces, of high-end conventional forces, and an emphasis on reviving military alliances like NATO, alliances with Japan and Australia, other countries in Asia, and in the pursuit of advanced military technologies to compete with those countries. So there's been a dramatic shift. And as a result of all of this, as Omar indicated at the beginning, conflict among the great powers, as distinct from low intensity war, is at a greater potential than at any time since, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, some 60 odd years ago. And we also see a high increasing risk of nuclear conflict. But as well as all this is going on, the great powers are also competing in other parts of the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia. And it's this larger global interplay that we hope to explore in these series of panels. And I think it's terribly important to see this big picture and the interplay of forces. And that's what we hope will begin now. And I'm really excited to hear from the rest of you. So I'll stop with that. And we're going to turn first to Constantine Fleshikoff, who will begin the conversation focusing on Russia.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you all. I'm looking forward to the discussion that, again, I hope we'll have in the end. I understand that the current situation in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, it's on everyone's mind, and I will do my best to address that. But let me start with some general things I want to say about Russian foreign policy. I think that the Russian national security establishment really has to address a series of hard questions. Questions like, how much isolation can Russia take? Does it want to remain an island in international relations? Another, as President Biden, I think, quite eloquently put it, at this point, Russian Federation is a country with nukes, but with no friends. Another set of questions, again, you know, that the Russian national security establishment, Russian elites have to address is, okay, are you comfortable with living in an imagined world, or are you going to face the harsh reality? I'll explain what I mean, kind of, you know, the subset of that question, for that question. So near abroad, right, you know, the special sphere of influence, the alleged alliance with China, then oil and gas as a solid foundation of Russian economy, and last but not least, NATO as a threat on the Western borders and as a threat that can be challenged and basically checked and dealt with. So let me start with near abroad. No matter what the Kremlin says or believes, Russia's influence in near abroad is on the wane. It's fading away. Russia is losing a competition to China in Central Asia, to Turkey in the Caucasus, of course to Europe in the western part of the country. The Russians can keep referring to the concept of near abroad as their version of the Monroe Doctrine. Does not help the reality. They're losing. Number two, all that talk about making alliance with China stronger, deeper, well, there are very serious limitations on that. Let's not forget that Russia's economy is number 11 in the world, next to South Korea. Well, South Korea is a great country and has great economy for a country of its size and potential. But Russia, well, it's stuck there. Clearly, in any relationship with China, Russia is a junior partner. You might say, okay, Russia is still a military superpower and China is not quite there yet. And you will be right. But China is getting there, as we all know, and with amazing advances, with amazing progress, not just in the quantity of weapons, but in the quality and the new technologies. So you've got a really junior economic partner dealing with a really strong economic partner, the economic partner, China, also on the way of becoming a military superpower. So, okay, this is not really an alliance. That's a partnership, that's a relationship, and There are problems. Okay, oil and gas. All right, for now, Putin and the Kremlin, they still can, blackmail Europe, saying, okay, you need our gas, you need this and that, otherwise it's winter, it's cold. Yes, but speaking about global warming, the Kremlin is very happy that now the so-called northern route, right? The shipping route along the Arctic coast of Russia. So that northern route is now more accessible. It's the future of world commerce. Great, good for you. But and that's because of the global warming, right? But that same global warming, right, is basically literally destroying the foundations of Russian gas and oil industry in the north. Permafrost is melting. The foundations of Russian, plants, they are starting to move like a decayed tooth. And gas and oil is still the foundation of Russian economy. Good luck with that. Last but not least, of course, NATO. I must say from the start that I am with George Kennan on the idea of NATO's expansion. I'm sure you remember that when first the idea came up, and Bill Clinton, Stuart Talbot, Kennan actually came out of retirement and spoke strongly against that. He said that NATO expansion is going to be a blunder, a strategic blunder of epic proportions, because it will not make Eastern Europe safer, but it will sure make Russia very angry. And in his words, militarism would come back to the Kremlin. He was absolutely right. That said, what's done is done. If we, well, I'm not sure we'll agree on that. I mean, that NATO eastward expansion was a folly. And then I'm sorry, but in the past few years, it's looking just as a farce. Excuse me, Montenegro is a NATO country. The most recent addition, North Macedonia, I'm sorry, you are serious? Then inviting Ukraine and Georgia, madness. But what's done is done. Now the United States or Brussels can't tell Mr. Putin, oh, we are sorry, we made a mistake. So what's done is done. This crisis in Eastern Europe was purely Putin's creation. There had been no provocation before that. I am running out of time, so I would say that I think that President Joe Biden is, I think, his policy in Europe is quite solid now. I know that many people were perplexed by his so-called megaphone diplomacy when he would announce Russian invasion next Tuesday or Monday afternoon. I think it's working because today we see first positive signs, and it will take time for the crisis to dissolve, but Putin has lost it, and Russia's losses are immense. So it's a loss for Putin. 10 more seconds. As long as Mr. Putin stays in the Kremlin, Russia's policy is not going to change. We'll see no cooperation with Russia. If Mr. Putin stays in the Kremlin for 75 more years, maybe he is immortal. But this means that we will not have stable peace in the East for 75 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Constantine. With that, we'll turn to Daria, who can talk to us more based on your research about, what can we think about, or how can we think about and understand Russian foreign policy from your perspective?
Well, also, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. I would also actually would like to pick up on the Biden's quote about Putin that Constantine already mentioned, that, like describing Putin as a guy with nukes but without friends. And actually, it's interesting that this quote has a striking similarity with a statement that is attributed to a Russian Tsar, Alexander III, from the 19th century, who once said, is believed to have said, Russia has only two allies, the army and the navy. And actually Putin is also fond of quoting Alexander III. So I just wanted to add here a little bit of historical continuity, so to speak, but I actually wanted to focus on one point, basically also trying to explain or understand Russia's foreign policy. And I wanted to focus on Russia striving for a great power status and how it connects to Russia's understanding of its own security and also how it concerns Russia's territorial integrity. So if we look at this current crisis now, on the one hand, it's actually unclear what it is about. Basically, there are two interrelated things. On the one hand, we have Ukraine, and on the other hand, there is this attempt also to revise the current world order. And to this ambiguity, what is this crisis really about? Also, Russia actually added, because if we look back last year, I mean, this escalation in Ukraine, it has been already in the air at least since like 1 year ago, also like December after the Second Karabakh War. Then you had escalation also preceding Putin and Biden summit last year in the summer. But basically, the like major events also happened in November, in December. So in November, you had a speech, Putin made a speech in front of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, kind of saying that our tensions have risen and they had some effect, so let them stay as long as possible. So this is for like Putin's motivation here, like urging then the Russia's foreign ministry to put these demands for security guarantees with the United States and NATO. Just before that meeting with the foreign ministry, the Russia's foreign ministry also basically published diplomatic correspondence that it had with Germany and France on negotiations with Ukraine, which is unprecedented. Basically, it looked as if Russia is going all in. And then you had this Putin demands for security cooperation published in December. So it was really like escalating. And then we had these negotiations with Russia, like with US, NATO, and OSCE in January. And in this, once this, like it was within a week, but what became clear when these negotiations took place is that this kind of discrepancy in the debates. So in the West, and it was actually the result of these parallel things with Russia's demands and what was going on in Ukraine. So on the one hand, in the West, you have the debate which is focused very much on Ukraine and whether Putin actually plans to invade it. Whereas in Russia, officials kept insisting and keep insisting that it's not about Ukraine, but about current European security architecture that does not accommodate interests of Russia. But on the expert level, also inside Russia, there is actually a discussion that like the key question of which is actually whether it is possible to revise the world order without having a war, which is also historically kind of doesn't have a precedent. So why Russia now wants to revise like the security structure in Europe, but also like the current, why it's unhappy with the current world order? Well, the problem is that Russia sees its great power status now challenged. And basically it's like throughout the last 30 years. So what Russia attempts to do with these tensions that Putin caused, so what Russia attempts to do is actually to regain its role it had in 1945 after the Second World War, but which was lost after the Cold War. So actually this like demands on security guarantees, it doesn't like, it's not a comeback of NATO military infrastructure to 1997, but actually kind of, if you look at larger, going back to 1945. Now regaining the Soviet, like regaining for Russia the Soviet role of 1945 does not mean restoring Soviet Union in terms of like assembling territories. And here I would also very much agree also with Constantine that Russia has been experienced really significant problems in its near abroad. But what it does mean, this striving is actually restoring geopolitical role that Soviet Union once had. And here I also would like to quote like this most often cited statement by Putin that he once said, I think it was 2005, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the last century. Like now this was picked up as if it was about restoring the like territory, actual territory of the Soviet, but actually he then explained that kind of if you don't regret the Soviet Union collapse, you don't have a heart, but if you want to restore it, you don't have a brain. So it really needs to be underlined, this kind of striving for geopolitical role of the Soviet Union, of the present Russia. Now the question is why and how great power status matters for Russia. And here this concern about great power status is very much closely interlinked with perhaps the most sensitive concern of Russia, namely its aversion to regime change. So in Russia, there is a widespread conviction that Russia cannot be conquered from abroad, but it can be destroyed from within. So basically, in understanding of in the political establishment, and I wouldn't even limit it to Putin, but also before Putin, starting from late 1990s. So regime change in Russia equals very much loss of state as such. And here is perestroika has been significant. In perestroika, this reforms undertaken in Soviet Union actually led to collapse. This regime change led to the loss of the state as such. So actually in this paradigm, only having a geopolitical role on the international arena can secure Russia as a state, or to put it even more precisely, its territorial integrity. So preventing regime change, actually coupled also with the striving for recognition as an equal from the West, this kind of recognition of Russia's geopolitical role, was also key motivation for Russia when it intervened in Syria. So in Syria, it was not so much Assad that Russia wanted to keep in power, but actually preventing this regime change that sparked by all of this colored revolution. So it was basically, the concern was there that this colored revolution would eventually reach Moscow itself. Now, what does this striving for a great power status of Russia mean for the current crisis? Like what Russia wants to achieve? Basically, Russia, the key concern here is that Russia wants a new line. That line used to be Berlin Wall during the Cold War, right? You had a clear division. You knew who, the spheres of influences have been clearly defined. But now, in thinking of Russia, you don't, Berlin Wall did not disappear. It just moves, it keeps moving closer to Russia. But this leaves us with two open questions, where this new line is going to be drawn, but also how, right? So because Putin raised these tensions, but now once they are there, it's also difficult to control them. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Daria. You've both given us a lot to think about. There are already some questions that I'm sure we'll return to, but we're going to shift to looking at China and China's foreign economic policy and political and diplomatic policy as well. I'll start with Min. You've written a lot about the various perspectives on China's rise, the Thucydides trap, the so-called clash of civilizations and divided peace, and you've analyzed how they differ from one another. So can you tell us a little bit about your analysis on these questions of China's rise and how it's framed?
Okay, well, thank you to Omar for organizing this event. And of course, Michael is co-organizer, and I already learned very valuable lessons, knowledge from Constantine and Daria. And so I will base my remark on the new article I submitted to Omar's special issue. And it's really, I wrote it way before your initiative, but I realized what I wrote was precisely the security in context idea. So I called a complicated competition between US and China in the last 10 years plus. Right? So US-China competition from TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to the Belt Road Initiative, and then to the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy. So in the US-China fields, there are currently there are common popular misperceptions and rhetorics. Several of them I speak to. One is that the US has adopted engagement policy toward China, and this engagement policy has failed. And second, the US-China competition is a relatively new phenomenon, and the previous administration were all making mistakes. And lastly, the only way to make the US win this competition is disengagement. Right? And I take issue with all of them. And I think I'm not IR a specialist but I'm reader of IR theories. And I think there are largely three sets of logic and beliefs shaping IR thinking. One is a Thucydides trap that look at the structural shift of balance and power, the most decisive factor in grand strategy. But the main believers and practitioners are really military and strategic practitioners. And then the clash of civilization groups that they underscore the competing values, norms, tradition, and political institutions. So this is basically whole society, whole political spectrum competition. And then from China, I think the counter theories is really the so-called divided peace. And so China strives for and argue for the possibility and preferences of separated coexistence. So, and I argue in this paper, the US-China competition has going on at least since 2008, very intense and persistent competition. But it happened in a very interdependent and very diverse regional context. So that's the way the great power competition has proceeded, featured multilateral initiatives, nesting multilateral initiatives, multiple issue linkages, and transnational actors with complex alignments, very different alignments. So in the article, I analyze the processes of the emergence of Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the origin was really the pivot to Asia, as launched by the second Bush later years, and then Obama, and carried out by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. But the pivot to Asia was actually pushed by Japan first. And so Japan led the strategic competition against China, and then rallied the maritime parts of ASEAN countries. It was very successful. But when Hillary Clinton took this pivot to Asia strategy, it became a military-focused alliances, and this made the Chinese reacted militarily, and their tensions in the maritime domain expanded. And there, we observe that the regional lobbying, regional actors enter in the mix and trying to persuade that the Washington strategy, this is not the way to go. And the pivot to Asia, solely focusing on military competition in segment, is not going to have bigger buy-in and foundation in the region. So they added the the TPP as an economic grouping foundation, and it worked. It really created enormous diplomatic strategic pressure on Beijing. But the Chinese response was also very nuanced, right? So against the TPP, the Chinese actually started, and there are two ways. One is they can utilize TPP and to conduct domestic reform. The other is they launched BRI as a countermeasures. If you do economic linkaging, we can also do economic and diplomatic linkaging. So that was one of the drivers of the BRI in China in late 2013. And so when China conducted a great power competition to BRI, the American responses and regional responses were also quite complex. So the United States, along with the regional actors, on the criticize, counterbalancing focused on two sets, right? One is on the development risk of the BRI projects. On that, the Chinese practitioners and they actually incorporated those criticism, and the other was in the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and that's more military oriented competition counterbalancing against China. So China locally criticized FOIP. But in reality, they also worked with different members in the Quad countries and trying to drive wedges. So we see that in response to this type of counterbalancing, we have China adapted the BRI into a more moderate version, and then China's utilizing the differences in FOIP to neutralize some of the pressure. But the Chinese criticism and limitation in the FOIP was also realized by Washington and by the regional members. So thus, we actually have experienced a new FOIP 2.0 in the Biden administration, right? So the current FOIP, they not only have the military aspects, they also have military plus, right? So the development, vaccine, economy, finance, etc., and infrastructure, and then then plus the Europe and broader Quad plus format. So I'll conclude very quickly. That is. Because I want to conclude by highlighting exactly what are the three legs of the competition is about, right? So the U.S. So FOIP is going this way, but that's not going to be sufficient for the U.S. grand strategy in competing with China. So they created this AUKUS. The Australia, UK, and the US as a military leg. So this is really about military deterrence. And then they have Quad, right? So they don't want to change the FOIP into a real FOIP. Actually, it's a Quad. But Quad is really about the value and democratic alliance against China. And the FOIP, this broader region, now is becoming the platform that constitutes much more complex competition with China. And now the Chinese response, it also has three legs. It has a military deterrence that focuses on territorial disputes. It tries to build a bilateral sphere of influence. And then they are also expanding measures and efforts in regional and multilateral initiatives. And in the Chinese, that piece of story actually overlapped significantly with FOIP. So I'll end here.
Thank you so much, Min. Lee, I'll go to you. And what I've appreciated about your various writings on this is really helped me think and reformulate the way that there's a certain projection on the Belt and Road as a grand strategy, top down, can be summarized by maybe even Xi Jinping himself sort of perspective, and you've tried to unpack and sort of problematize some of the frameworks that are used to explain the Belt and Road. But what can you tell us about sort of China's role and the consequences of it?
Thanks, Omar. And of course, Min has written an excellent book on that very subject as well. So I've been asked to talk about the BRI and the geopolitical contestation that has produced over development financing and the implications of that for the global south. And I suppose it's all been a bit doom and gloom tonight. So that's tonight where I am, this afternoon where most of you are. So I suppose actually I want to offer a bit more of a, not rosy, but less gloomy conclusion. And what I want to say is, can be quite controversial, I suppose, but I'm going to have to be relatively assertive about it and just state what I think. And if people want to challenge me, they can do so in Q&A. So there are four main points I want to make. The first is that the origins of the BRI are largely unrelated to great power competition, but are largely economic in nature. So I have written about this elsewhere with Jinghang Zheng and Shahar Hamiri. In my view, the BRI was not primarily about geostrategic competition. It is primarily a geospatial fix to deep-seated problems within the Chinese economy. The main objective is to externalize surplus capacity and capital through offering loans and securing overseas projects to keep the state-owned sector going, which is mired in debt and surplus capacity. The potential political benefits of this are to some extent a sort of added bonus, kind of win-win, if you like, as the Chinese like to put it. Secondly, the operations of the BRI, the way that BRI decision-making actually works, is also largely unstrategic. And again, I've written about this with Jinghang, and also there's a chapter on this, how it actually works, in my new book, Fractured China. The main argument that we have made is, and we're not alone in making this, is that the Chinese development financing regime, the institutional framework within China, is not geared towards dispensing development financing for geostrategic purposes. It is highly fragmented, and projects are not designed or placed by strategic planners in Beijing according to some kind of detailed blueprint or even an official map of where they want things to go. There is no official map of the BRI, and unofficial ones were banned in 2017. The truth is that Chinese development financing is recipient-led. So would-be recipient governments that are often egged on by Chinese state-owned enterprises prospecting for overseas businesses, they apply to Beijing for projects that they want. And then the two sides bargain over what they will finance, which state-owned enterprises are going to do it, et cetera, et cetera. So the BRI is consequently piecemeal. It's scattered, it's bottom up. It doesn't really add up to a coherent whole, and it certainly doesn't correspond to some detailed top-down plan that has been drawn up in Beijing. The third point is that nonetheless, the BRI does have geostrategic implications. If it doesn't have geostrategic causes, it nonetheless has geostrategic implications for two reasons. The first is that when things go well, which it doesn't always go well, for reasons I've just given, that it's very spotty and poorly governed, when it goes well, recipients have strengthened ties with China and they gain leverage against other states. So to take just one very small example, if you look at Cambodia, the BRI projects there, the Chinese projects there, are not well coordinated. They are quite ad hoc and fragmented. If you actually trace the origins of them, they don't emerge from some kind of strategic plan. But it is nonetheless the case that Chinese investment in Cambodia has greatly strengthened the Cambodian People's Party regime because it has fed its patronage network, and it has often come bundled with military aid, which strengthens a key component of the ruling coalition in Cambodia. And in exchange, Cambodia has clearly acted as a Chinese proxy in ASEAN discussions of the South China Sea, which has undermined its already very weak collective action there. And that help from China has also emboldened the CPP regime to risk its ties with the United States and EU which have cut aid and imposed sanctions over the CPP's authoritarian domestic practices. So you can see that these things have consequences for the way that other actors will behave. And the second reason why the BRI has strategic implications is that other major powers react to the BRI as if it is a geostrategic offensive. So I can write all the articles in the world telling you that it's not. But if the people that actually make foreign policy don't believe me, don't listen to me, then to them they see it through the lens of realism. So they have seen this as a threat, as something to compete with. And so they warn off recipients and say, don't buy in for this. This is a Chinese plot. It's debt trap diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have seen over time is China's rivals have launched rival development financing facilities, or they've boosted existing ones in order to compete with China. So from Japan, we saw the Quality Infrastructure Initiative in 2015. From the United States, the Development Finance Corporation in 2018 and Build Back Better World last year. Australia launched its infrastructure financing facility for the Pacific in 2019. The G20 set out principles for quality infrastructure investment in the same year. And the United States, Japan, and Australia set out the Blue Dot Network to implement the G20 principles in 2019 also. The UK has stuck its oar in with British International Investment, launched last year, and the EU belatedly launched its Global Gateway Initiative. So development financing, after being an area that has been dominated by the West for a long time, the rise of China as a provider has sparked fresh geopolitical contestation in this area. And fourthly, and this is where the sort of slightly rosier perspective comes in, is that insofar as this competition does not escalate into conflict, it doesn't escalate into pressure on developing countries to take sides decisively and balance against China, it's arguably beneficial for developing countries for two reasons. So first of all, it forces China to improve the quality and the governance of the Belt and Road Initiative. As Min mentioned, China has been very sensitive to debt trap diplomacy accusations, notably at the 2019 Belt and Road Forum. So Xi Jinping promised to better quality projects and a clean and green Belt and Road. The Ministry of Commerce and other regulatory agencies have tightened regulations to try to prevent the sorts of corruption and white elephant projects that have been emerging around the world. The Commission for Discipline Inspection has dispatched agents to some troubled projects, for example, in Laos, to try to curb corruption. The second reason it could benefit developing countries is that it provides more choice and leverage to developing country governments. So recipients may now feel more alert to the risks of BRI projects and more emboldened and encouraged to scrutinize proposed projects and to bargain harder, whereas in the past, they may have felt that they basically had no choice but just to take the terms being offered by Chinese enterprises. They may also be able to access better technical support in order to evaluate prospective projects for the likely return and make more sensible choices for themselves. And they may have more choice among providers. Though I do think that China and Japan, in East Asia, Japan, will likely remain the dominant providers for the foreseeable future, because the basic model of development financing that the West is still pushing is still limited by neoliberal modalities. But I think those things, as long as competition between China and the West does not escalate into outright conflict, then this could potentially be somewhat beneficial for developing countries.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lee. I'm going to turn to Michael in a second for a response by you, Michael, or some thoughts, and then maybe we'll have some responses. But before I do, I just wanted to pose some of the questions that were asked in the chat, and then maybe our panelists can think about those if they want to jump in after Michael goes. One question was, how does Russian foreign policy towards Eastern Europe and former Soviet countries differ from US policy towards Latin America? I'm supposing that referring to the Monroe Doctrine, I guess, of sort of spheres of influence. If we look at the number of foreign interventions, violation of treaties, civilian and military casualties from foreign interventions in the past 20 years, neither Russia nor China come anywhere near the US. Given this, how is it possible to put the blame on the current crisis? only on Russia or China. We had maybe a couple more. How does China see the EU-US cooperation on China, I suppose? This sort of discussions on between US and Europe on how to confront or react to China. So yeah, these are some of the questions that have been posed, and I think we might want to touch on those, but before that, I'll go to Michael.
I'm sort of still taking in these riches of research and analysis. It'll take me some while to process all of that. So congratulations to all of you for very thoughtful presentations. I think the time compression helped us all to focus our thoughts. So it was great. All terrific. I've been thinking lately a lot about the Soviet term from the 1960s and 70s called the correlation of forces. Maybe this is an older term even, going back to revolutionary days. And our friends who study Russia might help me with this. But I do remember at a time when Russian military literature spoke a lot about the correlation of forces in the world. And there was a time when Soviet analysts said that the correlation of forces favored the Soviet Union. This was when there were communist revolutions occurring around the world and Soviet influence appeared to be spreading. And then that seemed to come to an end. And in the Reagan period, this term was adapted by the U.S. military with the Reagan doctrine of undermining pro-Soviet regimes in the Third World, in Angola and elsewhere, that the correlation of forces had shifted from the Soviet Union to the West. And a correlation of forces was a combination of hard military strength, of alliances, of the morale of respective peoples, of technology. And it's much on my mind today. And I really am curious what all of you think about the correlation of forces. I say this because I believe that the Biden administration and its top officials believe that over the past 20 years, when the US was focused on wars, counterterrorism wars, the forever wars, that the correlation of forces had shifted against the US towards Russia and China because of our preoccupation with these futile forever wars while Russia and China were gaining strength. And it's been a principle shared objective of US foreign policy elites, whether they're Republican or Democratic now, to reverse this trend and to shift the correlation of forces against China, against Russia, back to the United States by any means necessary to fight on every level, to isolate Russia and China in international affairs, to diminish their alliances, to regain technological superiority, to do everything possible to accomplish that shift. So I wonder if this makes sense to you, or whether you have anything to say about that. But you don't have to, and you could answer the other questions.
Lee, I might go back in reverse order to you. You had some thoughts about one or a couple of the questions.
I don't really think that the correlation of forces has moved decisively against the United States, in the sense that if you really want to count up the number of firm allies that, say, Russia or China have, then they're not many. If you look at Southeast Asia, for example, which is China's backyard, then you'd have to say kind of Laos and Cambodia are maybe the main allies. And these are tiny, really kind of geostrategically irrelevant countries. The rest of the countries in the region, if they were really pushed, they don't want to pushed, but if you really did push them, they would side with the United States. And I don't think that's that different with Russia. I think I very much agree with what Constantine says. The position that the Russian regime finds itself in is a position of weakness, geopolitical weakness. Russia is economically weak, militarily weak. So it's not so much the balance that the constellation of forces really moved against the United States. It's that the United States has shot itself in the face. So the problem is that the West, enjoying a position of US hegemony and unipolarity after the Cold War, abandoned any sense of self-restraint, abandoned the basic rules of diplomacy, which involve reckoning with the interests of other powerful states and conceding certain things to them, and recklessly blundered around the world, engaging in, as Michael says, the forever wars. It's the United States that has been the biggest revisionist power in the world over the last 30 years. And it's the one that has violated fundamental norms of international order, notably the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, by rampaging around in the name first of human rights and then the war on terror. And it's that has massively destabilized the Middle East and North Africa and created openings for the kinds of proxy wars that we've seen in Syria. And I think, as Constantine said, it's the expansion of NATO and to a secondary degree, the EU into the Russian borderlands that has provoked a reaction from Moscow. And nobody should be surprised by that, because the moment that these things were put on the agenda, Moscow immediately reacted and said, you really shouldn't do this. We regard this as a threat to our security. And this is where basic failings of international diplomacy comes to the fore. It has not been, the West has not seen any reason to compromise with Russia. And it, I think, has therefore blundered into conflict. What would be so bad about creating a demilitarized buffer zone between NATO and Russia? What would be so bad about Finlandization for countries like Georgia and Ukraine? Finland's not a bad place to be. That's the way I think to get stability in that region. And I think Constantine's right that the EU and NATO don't feel like they can step down, but there's a reason for that, which is that they've lost the ability to reckon with the interests of other powerful states. They're not thinking strategically. They're not thinking through the traditional lens of strategy, about thinking about balance and compromise and concert and things like that. They are still thinking in very warped terms, informed by liberal ideology. So I think that has to be constantly borne in mind, that these countries still conceive of themselves as being weak. In Russia's case, it is weak, and China thinks of itself as a developing country, which in many respects it still is, and one that is surrounded by American military bases and allies. And it sees the United States as vehemently opposed to Chinese development and the restoration of what China's current government thinks is its rightful place in the world, again, as a great power. And that's its historical role. But it is convinced that the United States will not allow that to happen. And the United States is proving that they are right.
Thank you, Lee. I promise our panelists the panel will go for an hour, but I'm going to cheat because my introduction took a few minutes. So we'll go for a few more minutes to see if our panelists have some last thoughts about any of these questions or anything that's been said. Min, I'll go to you next.
Okay, so maybe I'll just reiterate a couple of things. Number one, I think the US-China competition has been very intense, so it's not new. But the US focus or action was diverted a little bit by the by anti-terrorist policy domestically, and yet its regional partners were picking up the slack. Right? So the previous 20 years competition with China, if the US plus Japan plus its partners, it was not losing. It's just competing just as intensely and effectively. And on the other hand, China thinks not in a zero-sum term as a US strategist think. So the Chinese, they calculate the powers in a much more comprehensive way. And as a rising power, it still thinks so in a positive sum way. And now the US is returning, and the chances are there will be a lot of excesses conducted to be expected from the United States. I think its allies will make the US see its mistakes. And in terms of US-Europe coordination, it's a relationship with intensified cooperation with regional allies. Sometimes I feel a little bit funny because the United States often take credit at this, like, we made this happen, our success at the cost of our rivals. But in reality is the more complex, more overlapping competitive actors actually allows more different kind of relationship and competition to take place. And the Chinese, on the other hand, if the US is missing because of its domestic problems, then the chances are the Chinese exercise of power or conduct of power will go on the excesses and made the mistakes, right? So I think these two, I'm a martial arts fan, right? So these two are really playing a very interesting competitive game, and their principles, mechanisms are quite clear. Although I want to make a point that strategy is not about the end. And the end point is never clear. It's how you process, conduct the grand strategy competition. That's where we should pay a lot of attention. The end, no one can decide the end yet.
Thank you. Daria?
Yes, thank you. Maybe briefly just to add about this idea of correlation of forces, but I'm not that much familiar with military equipment, but I would simply add perhaps what to the military capacity, we also need to add the question, like if we want to understand how it's likely to evolve, what is at stake for particular parties in this conflict, right? So what is at stake for Russia and what is at stake for the West? And basically we see also, I would also agree with Lee here, this inability to compromise, it basically has to do that you have here on the one hand interests and then principles. And there you have like kind of irreconcilable positions. And to that, so a way out, and I would also like add the question also from a chat, what was about how Russia cooperates with allies, but also competes with them. Like based on, for example, my research on Turkey and Russia, who are like historical rivals, right? More like a dozen of wars in the last 500 centuries. Well, how they cooperate, it's based basically on two principles. First, it's recognition of interests. And then it's a prospect of mutually beneficial cooperation. So I guess I basically picked up this idea from Axelrod, like game theory, shadow of the future, right? So in order to have a cooperation, you basically need a shadow of the future that will make you cooperate. But the like precondition of it so that you don't, your interests are not fundamentally opposed to each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Constantine.
Thank you. I will try addressing two questions from the chat room, and then, of course, address Michael's provocative question. So first, what's the difference between Russia in what Russia does in near abroad and what the United States did or is doing in Latin America? You're absolutely right. You know, the two approaches are very similar. The difference is that in the past several decades, maybe 2 decades, right, the United States is relying more on soft power in Latin America, while Russia is still, you know, in the age of cannon boats and hard power in near abroad. So different stages, different tools, but you're right, structurally that's very similar. Another question. So many US interventions in the past 20 years, so why blame just Russia for the current crisis? Well, we're talking about a regional crisis. No matter how scared we are of, this potential for world war, God forbid, but it's a regional crisis in Eastern Europe. And just as the United States was and is responsible for the terrible mess in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, right? Russia is responsible for the mess in Eastern Europe. And finally, addressing Michael's question, the only thing I can contribute to this conversation is the future of alliances of the West. I don't know when it's going to happen, but maybe we're talking about next generation in the U.S. National security establishment, but someone has to address the issue of NATO. NATO is 73 years old. Alliances just can't go on forever. What's the sphere of responsibility? What's the mission? And so on and so forth. We don't have an answer to that question, but one option that we could imagine would be, the continental Europe going more or less its way, and the United States, maybe with the UK and Canada, doing their own North Atlantic thing.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for that. Michael, any last words or before we end?
No, I think this was a terrific discussion. I wish we could go on longer. I have more questions, but I think we should allow for more cross discussion.
Great, thank you. No, I'm sure there's a lot more to say and to discuss. I wanted to thank our panelists, and hopefully this will be the first of a series of discussions that we can have with all of you. Again, more focused discussions. This was really helpful for us to contextualize all the different, the main issues at stake, and look forward to continuing the discussion together. Thank you so much.